As the world is upbeat with several promising COVID-19 vaccines, wealthy nations are buying up billions of doses while developing countries struggle to secure their share. Where does the race towards a vaccine leave the world's poorest? Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Rida Fakhri. Recent breakthroughs in COVID-19 vaccine trials in the US, UK, Russia and China have raised hopes that the spread of the coronavirus pandemic, which has already killed almost 1.4 million people worldwide, could soon be contained and eventually ended. But these breakthroughs have also raised concerns about the access and availability of vaccines for developing nations, with high-income countries claiming a disproportionate share of vaccine doses, often in significantly higher numbers than the size of their populations. So what are the prospects for the rest of the world? To find out, we traveled to Peru, a country with the world's worst COVID-19 per capita death toll, and India, which has the world's second highest number of infections.
Cuando llegó la pandemia acá a Perú, todo se cerró. Todo, o sea, fue como que todo se paralizó. Y fue fatal porque las cifras subían y subían todos los días. Y bueno, había temor.
When the news came in that Corona has come, COVID-19, it has struck the world, I knew that something is coming, but we never expected that our business will be affected like this. I have started this home delivery system, but home delivery business also things are bad. People are scared to buy food from outside. And I have limited my staff to 4-5 people, and I have cut down their salary to half. That is how I am functioning. That is the only way to survive, what to do.
Antes de la pandemia, nuestro negocio era muy exitoso. Es más, estábamos a punto de cerrar uno de los negocios más maravillosos que nos habían podido dar. Entonces, de repente vino la pandemia y nos quedamos con todo ese proyecto a puertas. No ingresaba nada al Perú, no salía nada del Perú. Y ahí nos dimos cuenta que había una necesidad de mascarillas. Entonces, llamamos a unos proveedores, conseguimos el material y empezamos a hacer las mascarillas. Fue muy difícil, pero no imposible, pues lo logramos, ¿no?
We have all been expecting a vaccine. A good vaccine might help. I will not be the first person to go and take the vaccine. Only if I find that it is effective and it has got no other bad side effects. I heard one vaccine is coming from Russia. Indian doctors are also very, very efficient. So you can't say. Maybe Indians might find the vaccine first. Let's hope and pray for the best. I think this pandemic will end. It has to end.
Nosotros esperamos de que esto de verdad cambie pronto porque necesitamos vivir de una forma cómoda, ¿no? No en austeridad. Creo que todos trabajamos para poder tener una vida digna, ¿no? Bueno, si llegase a Perú una vacuna que ya está probada, que es 100% segura, claro que sí nos la pondría. Si llegará pronto a Perú, en verdad, sí, siendo sincera, no creo. Tengo entendido que ya hay vacunas, pero que ya están pedidas. Entonces no sé si nosotros alcanzaremos, como somos un país de Latinoamérica. Yo creo que los países más ricos sí van a tener acceso prioritario a la vacuna. Ellos, es más, se van a estoquear también que nos van a dejar sin nada.
With a new wave of coronavirus infections sweeping across different parts of the world, disrupting the economic recovery of nations and upending the lives of rich and poor countries alike, will the promise of COVID-19 vaccines level the playing field, or will it deepen inequalities that have been exposed and exacerbated by the pandemic? Joining me now to discuss the hopes and anxieties of countries in the Global South is the former Health Minister of Brazil, Dr. Luiz Henrique Mandetta. Dr. Mandetta, Brazil is one of the worst hit countries when it comes to the pandemic. It was the first country in South America to report a COVID-19 infection. It then became one of the epicenters for the virus. I believe over 1,000 people are still dying every single day. So it desperately needs a vaccine like so many other countries do, but many people in the developing world have been saying that they are worried that they will have to wait a very long time for a vaccine, with wealthy nations buying up all of the available and future supplies. How optimistic are you about the recent breakthroughs, and how concerned are you about the lack of distribution and access that some of the poorer countries in the region will have?
Well, thanks for having me here. This is something that's been happening since the beginning. We watch it happen for the ventilators, for masks, for all the things that we need to face this disease, and the world just doesn't have a leader to try to sit and put everybody together to do it as a humankind task. So I think that Brazil has a very important role to play in South America, because that's how we could together try to solve it in the whole continent. Just our health system is the strongest one in South America, and Brazil has a huge population and has capacity to produce the vaccines. So if we were doing this together, I think that we could solve for countries like Paraguay, Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, which are small countries that doesn't have such a strong health system and economy to buy it. We're going to spend the whole 2021 trying to solve this problem. So I'm realistic that we are going to have problems about it. And I'm realistic that a leadership will have to go through this empty place to solve it.
Well, you talk about leadership, and many people look at what's going on in Brazil and they see the kind of political leadership there, the president, Bolsonaro, with whom you've had a fallout, dismissing, undermining the seriousness of the virus. They've also made very strong anti-China, for example, remarks in recent weeks, especially the president, while we know that the Chinese have been developing a few vaccines that are in the final stages of trials, some of them being tested in many countries, including Brazil. Are you confident about the safety and efficacy of these vaccines, and do you think that politics might stand in the way?
Politics have been standing in the way since the beginning. Bolsonaro is no different than Trump. What they did is quite about the same thing, is to deny the infection and try to move the economy without caring about lives. The American people gave the answer already, and I think that here is going to have the same destiny. So he better behave, and he better do his job with the governor from São Paulo, which is the vaccine that is closer to us. Probably in December, we are going to have the final studies of this vaccine, and in January we will be starting to release this vaccine in São Paulo. So I'm pretty sure that the force of the numbers of lives being lost for his denial is going to make him move forward. But beside that, I think that we have Mercosur, which are 4 countries that can really stay together: Uruguay, Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay. We have the Andinos countries that could join together, and we have the PAHO, the Pan American Health Organization, that could work as a mechanism to try to solve this in the Americas. I think that it's going to be a very hard for him to stay against life once again.
And you mentioned Sao Paulo. Sao Paulo decided to import almost 50 million doses of one of the Chinese vaccines. But Brazil has a lot of challenges, though, doesn't it? It has a population of over 200 million. It's the largest country in South America, one of the most populous in the world. And many of the cities, including Sao Paulo, but others as well, Rio de Janeiro, are overpopulated. There's an estimated 12 million people living in those marginalized communities, in favelas and slums, where the rate of infection is reportedly 3 times higher than the national average. Social distancing between now and when the vaccine is available is a luxury. It's a real challenge, isn't it? What is the government doing to address this?
Well, this disease came to show inequity. It came to show how long are we going to tolerate so much difference between poor people with poor homes, poor water, and rich people. So I hope that this will be able to wake them up. But Brazil has a very strong immunization system. It's the largest of the world. It's the country that most releases vaccines every year for flu, and it has their facilities all over the country. It's centralized. It has a very good logistic. It is used to deal with vaccines. So I think that in one, you have like a very different logistic in Brazil than you have in other South American and African countries. We work together with African countries that speak Portuguese. They kind of come together with Brazil. Countries like Angola, Mozambique, and all those countries, they ask Brazilian help in health issues. So what we're going to see is in the South Hemisphere, we're going to see Brazil play a role in production, not only important, but production. The Butantan Institute in São Paulo and Fiocruz in Rio de Janeiro are already planning to produce more than 150 million doses that could end the problem in Brazil. But if they could do that together with the other South American and African countries, I think that an industrial complex could solve this problem. That's one of the tools that the humanity would have to deal with the problem. Try to find some other places to produce the vaccine.
But how important is it, though, for leaders of those countries, including yours? The president having called the virus nothing more than a little flu, telling Brazilians to stop being sissies. Just how detrimental is this attitude to the kind of collective effort that you're talking about?
That's a shame. He's specialized in destruction, not in construction. He's unable to build something, to lead something that depends on more people that are different from him. So, but I think that disease will push him. It will pass through him. I think that we have the Congress that will talk about it, the judiciary system that are going to go by it. It's a pity that he couldn't lead South America in its way out of this disease. But I think that it's a shame for Brazil that have such a nice, a very strong health system that could do much better, but to have such a bad leadership.
If you were still in charge of the health ministry today, what would you advise him? What would you do differently? And how would you advise other neighboring countries that are still struggling to deal with this issue?
Let's work together. Let's sit around the table and figure out how can we, because it's not interesting to Brazil to solve its problem and the other countries not solve it. Our economy is so attached to each other. We have mechanisms to do that. We could work with mechanisms like World Health Organization to try to bring it together for these countries. We have China that has a large capacity of producing. Brazil has a large capacity of producing. Let's work on the price of those vaccines to those countries that doesn't have enough money to buy it.
But what about rich countries? To what extent would you ask them to do things differently? Because a lot of them are hoarding a lot of these supplies. They've bought up the bulk of what's available, and well into the future, there won't be much for the rest of the world. They'll have to wait several years. We heard the Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, saying it's all very well and good to say that developed countries are committed to distributing and giving access to any future vaccines, but there needs to be more of a plan in place. Do you think that they're doing their part of what needs to be done?
Well, I was in office when I had the G20 meeting in Japan, in Osaka, and we were there, and the whole meeting was about universal coverage on health. We just watched them making this year's meeting, a virtual meeting, and they were talking about giving access. Now, besides talking, they need to show action around this. So what I think is going to happen is that we are connected. We are not going to end this problem because Germany has interests in Peru. They need Peru to be working well. They need Paraguay to be working well. They need the Middle East. They need the African countries. Everybody needs the whole planet to be safe. So we are going to have to do this. The fastest we do, the fast economy will come back. So they have economic interest in solving it. I think that they're going to try to solve their home problems first, but immediately they'll try to solve the economic ways to take the economy from where it came. So in this way, I think that Brazil has a role in G20, has a role in South America and Central America, in the Americas and in the African countries, to try to call attention of the developed countries that those countries, they have the way to do it, and they need that they take a careful look on it so that we can solve the problem. I think that we'll solve during the year.
All right, on this optimistic note, Dr. Luiz Mandetta, former Minister of Health of Brazil, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation.
Now, scientists around the world have been working at an unprecedented pace to test different types of vaccines that could help stop the spread of COVID-19. There are currently more than 150 vaccines being tested for safety and efficacy. Some are still in the early stages of development. Others have made it to phase 3 trials and beyond. A few are showing real promise. A Chinese vaccine developed by Sinopharm has been given to almost 1 million people in the UAE, Bahrain, Argentina, and other countries. Russia's Sputnik V vaccine was administered in clinical trials to nearly 40,000 volunteers and is reported to have 92% efficacy. A vaccine developed in the UK by Oxford University and AstraZeneca was tested on 24,000 people in 3 countries and is said to have an efficacy rate of up to 90%. It is also expected to be one of the cheapest vaccines. And the United States has developed 2 vaccines that have already completed phase 3 trials with reported efficacy rates of up to 95%. Now, some of these vaccines will have to be kept at minus 75 degrees Celsius, which brings with it serious logistical problems and additional costs. A new global assessment of pre-purchasing agreements shows that high-income countries have already procured nearly 3.8 billion doses, with an option to buy an additional 5 billion. This means low-income countries will have to rely almost entirely on COVAX, a global initiative to provide equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines. Meanwhile, India and South Africa have mounted a joint effort at the World Trade Organization to call for a patent-free vaccine. The proposal received widespread support from developing nations, with China welcoming the initiative and the US and EU opposing it. Joining me now to discuss this proposal and the options available to developing nations is Mustaqeem De Gama, Counsellor at the South African Mission to the World Trade Organization. Mr. De Gama, South Africa and India want patent protections and intellectual property rights to be waived so that developing countries can have access to COVID-19 vaccines so they can copy and distribute them more freely. But you are up against some very powerful forces at WTO, the US, the EU, and others. Realistically, how likely is that to happen?
Well, I think it's a cause worth fighting for. I think your viewers will also know the background that developing countries have been advocating for better access to medicines. And I think COVID-19 is really a counterpoint and indicates all of the shortcomings of the global system. And so from that point of view, I think our chances of getting an outcome is very good. If you look at the support we've obtained in the various meetings, we are confident that we will get an outcome. And certainly there is a legal responsibility on the World Trade Organization to ensure that it does everything it can to assist in the fight against COVID-19.
China has welcomed the proposal, but you are up against developed nations that say that they have fought for decades for better protection for their pharmaceutical industries. They say intellectual property rights is part of the solution, not the problem. So what do you say to those who argue that these profits are driven by the risk that companies are actually taking, that they are an important driver of innovation, that without them, in fact, you wouldn't have a vaccine so quickly?
Well, I would say that IP certainly has been proven to be a barrier to access. And many say that there are no problems with IP, but that's not correct. I think the clearest indication of this is a previous decision that was taken by the World Trade Organization in respect of the pandemic of HIV and AIDS. And that decision clearly allowed developing countries to access medicines that were otherwise not available, that were subject to intellectual property protection. And so from that point of view, we think that intellectual property protection is important, but it cannot be seen as an absolute right. I believe that you have to at least balance that particular right against societal interests.
You mentioned the efforts that South Africa made 20 years ago when it was successful in actually pushing the price of HIV drugs down, but things have changed, haven't they? Are you able now to force countries like Japan, like the US, other countries within the EU to back down on this issue?
Given the global need for solidarity, we believe that there would be a basis for us to agree on limited measures to address COVID-19. So in the end, I believe that based on where we are now, we should be able to come to some sort of agreement with these countries.
But how critical is it to have governments approach this differently? And will they? Because you have said that governments have outsourced their responsibility for public health to just a few pharmaceutical companies that are holding them ransom. But many governments are actually subsidizing these companies. They're getting millions of dollars in taxpayer money. And how else do you get the vaccines that are needed if you don't allow pharmaceutical companies the space, the profit margins they say they need to develop a COVID-19 vaccine?
Well, you're correct. Governments have a pivotal role to play, especially when it comes to the public health policy. And you're also correct that governments have invested quite a lot of public money that is responsible for many of the products and processes that we see now. And so from that perspective, governments should be in a position to tie some strings to the public money that is given, either in a direct way through subsidies or in an indirect way through funding to higher education institutions. And so governments, firstly, should be able to say any collaboration, even with the private sector, that results in a product, in a vaccine, as you say, should be subject to certain limitations. Firstly, companies can't just decide to charge any price they wish to. Secondly, it may be that under certain circumstances, companies can be forced to share technology in order to ramp up production and so forth. We would have seen in the last few weeks companies making announcements about vaccines and the efficacy of these vaccines. However, what we see is that they just do not have the production capacity to ramp these vaccines up for distribution. So take, for example, Pfizer. Pfizer has indicated that they will produce 50 million doses before the end of this year and 1.5 billion doses before the end of next year. This means that in actual fact, if you look at a 2-dose regimen, that you only cover a very small part of the global population. And so from
you are right. And actually, some of the current models and research that has been done is projecting that the developing world won't get a vaccine until 2023, 2024. So that's a long wait. But what about the manufacturing capacity of developing countries? India is the world's biggest manufacturer of vaccines. It is now in the process of developing its own COVID-19 vaccine. It's in fact in its phase 3 trials, and the vaccine could be ready in a month or two. But just how important is it to have countries like India produce these vaccines, and do other countries have the same manufacturing capacity?
Not every developing country has the capacity of India, for example, or China or Brazil. And this is really the point, that the more producers you have that are capable to scale up production, the faster people will have access to the vaccine. And so in principle, it's a good idea to have more people produce a public good, something that has common interest and a positive impact on the lives of people. And so from that point of view, we think that it's a good idea to allow countries that have capacity to actually ramp up production to ensure effective access. Because ultimately, as you say, the projection is that most developing countries will only get access to the vaccine in 2022, 23. And this is quite a long wait. What are the consequences of that delay? Well, the delay causes certain economic impacts. These economies would have to stay closed. The longer they stay closed, they cannot earn any revenue, and this has a knock-on effect on levels of poverty, and ultimately, if people don't die from COVID-19, they certainly will die from hunger.
All right, Mustaqeem De Gama, Counsellor for the South African Mission to the World Trade Organization, thank you very much. So while developing countries struggle to ensure fair access to vaccines, it is self-evident that defeating COVID-19 requires a concerted, worldwide effort, a sequence plan that can truly ensure the eradication of this lethal virus, and given its velocity, it has to be a global strategy. But the vaccine nationalism exhibited by some developed nations that have already secured the lion's share of prospective vaccine productions is a mere band-aid, a palliative that could backfire. The longer the virus remains in circulation, the greater the risks that it could mutate and linger, endangering all nations, rich and poor alike. That's all from me, Rida Fakhri, and the team here in Washington. Till next time, thanks for watching.